everyone. Thank you for joining our most latest session on the reverse pitch series that I've been doing here at the office for close to a year now. I want to thank you again for all the new people and then all the people who have returned for a different investor this time. Welcome again. My name is Randall Fink, so I lead investment here for the Israeli Economic Mission here on the West Coast. So I'm located in San Francisco. In total, we have 45 offices around the globe. We have 3 others in the US, including Houston, Washington, DC, and New York City. But of course, our offices are located strategically around the globe to sort of help Israeli companies get their presence in those markets. So our mission, of course, is to work with Israeli companies to get them connected in those different ecosystems for their various verticals. For me, I work with all the verticals since I work with investment, but I specifically also work with fintech, automotive, and a few others. Of course, our mission is to work with innovation teams at large and medium-sized enterprises, as well as different investors in our ecosystem, including creative ventures, which we have on the call here right now, in order to get you connected and in order to grow your company. So that's what we're looking to do, and that's our strategic advantage as well, is the one context that we have, not only me, but everyone in our office. So that's what we're looking to do in order to create those connections and in order to, hopefully, if it makes sense, find the right partnerships. And I'm happy to say just a couple of months ago, as a result of one of these reverse pitch series, that we actually had an investment into the company that attended one of these sessions. So, anything is possible, and happy to, create those connections and looking forward to anything that you can do as a result of that. But yeah, just to jump right in, this is James Wang. He's a general partner at Creative Ventures. So they're an early stage VC focused on healthcare, agriculture, and industrial technologies. Yeah, so himself, he's also a co-founder of Linus Health. So previously he was on the core investment team at Bridgewater Associates. He founded a nonprofit consulting firm, which specialized in microfinance, and also did a stint at Google X's Makani project. He holds an MBA at UC Berkeley, where he was a Jack Larson Fellow in Entrepreneurship, with a BA with honors from Dartmouth, and an MS in Computer Science at Georgia Tech. He also holds a data science specialization from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and completed the course track for a PhD designated emphasis in computational sciences and engineering at UC Berkeley as well. With all that said, I'll go ahead and pass it over to James, who will go ahead and lead this presentation. And I do want to mention, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can use the chat. You can ask them as soon as we finish the presentation. And yeah, looking forward to all the questions that you have. But at this point, I'll let James take over.
Wonderful. Appreciate it, Randall. And just in terms of this, I'm hoping to keep the presentation relatively fast. Really looking forward to having questions from folks and just being able to answer stuff. So let's jump into it. So as Randall mentioned, we're an early stage deep tech fund. What that means, and let me see if I can just put this thing up. And it's a very short presentation, I promise. What it means is we invest in mostly deep tech sectors. So the specific areas that we invest in end up being synthetic biology, AI, robotics, advanced materials, these sorts of areas that in general, software VCs don't tend to focus in, which creates a nice niche in terms of for us, but also creates specialization on our side. So I'm actually one of the, designated emphasis in terms of graduated designated emphasis is not a full PhD. So I'm actually one of the few folks on our team who does not have a full PhD. On my side, mere masters in computer science and other things. But one of the core things in terms of our team is actually every single person has this sort of core duality of both business experience as well as technical experience. So we have a PhD in terms of material science, as well as a PhD in robotics, and basically folks who have a lot of technical experience who can really weigh into these markets. So I mentioned markets, though, in part because our viewpoint is actually the markets are more important than the technology itself. A lot of our peer VCs tell us that we seem fairly fearless about technical risk, and I would disagree with that characterization. The reason being, if you're actually able to understand the technology, it doesn't end up being, okay, there's a ton of technical risk here. We're able to assess as engineers, scientists, whatnot ourselves, looking at this technology, looking at this company, is this something that is able to go to market but requires engineering? Or is there a fundamental scaling problem, say actually one that you run into a lot in synthetic biology? Or is there a fundamental scaling problem in terms of this where you need a breakthrough or three in order to actually bring this thing to market? So for us, we're actually willing to jump in earlier than most VCs because we can tell the difference between the two. We know that when a technology just needs engineers to be able to take it to be able to be refined and productized, or if it fundamentally just, you can't get it there unless you actually have fundamental changes or breakthroughs. So for us, that means our emphasis ends up actually being on the market itself. So when Randall mentioned the specific areas we work in, the reason why we do is because on one side, demographics drive the healthcare thesis in terms of healthcare costs going up over time because of chronic disease, demographic change. And on the other side, just in terms of the other side of the coin for demographics, you also have a trend where you basically have labor shortages, because if you think about it, fewer young people, more old people, relatively speaking, oversimplifying, in an economy, that means that you have fewer young people to run manual labor problems, which means you either have to bring down standard of living, which no one ever likes, or you have to massively increase productivity. That's what drives ultimately the areas that we invest in. And in terms of climate change, lots of battery technologies and whatnot, but that ultimately is what drives the areas we invest in. Not the technologies themselves, just hard enough problems that if they were able to be solved with conventional technologies, they would have already. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here. There's a lot of areas where the problems are big and only getting bigger. So as we go, we expect a lot of these different markets to ultimately drive the companies, but the technologies needed to address them tend to be, again, these deep technologies. So we end up focusing quite a bit. We only invest in 20 to 30 companies per fund. We lead rounds. We actually generally take board seats, and generally founders are actually quite happy about that because we see our role as being able to know these markets, know the customers, know the way that you can go to market, and actually have expertise in terms of helping you succeed. Because that's the big thing about deep tech. In a software company, you can rewrite your code, change your Google AdWords target, and basically be in a completely different market the next day. It's not quite that simple, but it actually gets kind of close to that for software companies, for pure software companies. For the areas that we invest in, I mean, you wouldn't think that that works with synthetic biology or robotics, but even for AI, which looks like pure software, right? Most valuable AI companies have proprietary data sets, say in healthcare, for example. If you have kidney disease data, for example, you're not going to suddenly be able to do cardiac, be able to diagnose like cardiac problems or something. So as a whole, you actually need to be able to target the right place. That's why we're so focused, and we end up working with the companies to basically succeed over time. I mean, in terms of one of our companies at this point, even though we're one of the smallest investors, and they recently had raised a round that valued them at over $500 million, we're still one of the most active investors at this point, even though just in terms of our check size, it's at this point relatively small, very small actually, relative to everyone else who's come in later. And yeah, in terms of discipline, we don't really deviate. So we always do actually target these specific areas. And as pretty much said before, we all have a lot of these different experiences in terms of mix of both business and technical to be able to help companies. So for us, we lead rounds. Just in terms of our typical check size, it's around $1 million. But at this point, we've led rounds up to 10, 11 million in size in terms of our, in terms of just rounds that we've done recently. And part of the reason is because we've gained somewhat of a reputation in the area. We're able to act as a signal for other investors. We are likely going to raise a larger fund in order to actually do more fully the rounds that we basically do all the work in, and everyone else joins us. So, but nonetheless, this actually tends to be the dynamic that we have nowadays. And yeah, for us, we're willing to lead rounds. We're willing to tell you pretty concretely why we're interested in investing, what stage of the process you're at. And we'll tell you And the thing that I like to say, excuse me, is we will tell you yes, no, and why. So a lot of VCs like to tend to jump around and basically tell you, well, come back later, come back later, come back later. For us, we'll actually pretty concretely tell you this is our set of concerns. And if you're actually able to address it, we're interested. Or it's just outside of our area entirely, or we think that this isn't a market at all. So that's pretty much about us. A lot of these characteristics in terms of being able to focus, being able to tell you why we invest or not, and being able to give you concrete feedback goes a lot again to how focused we end up being in terms of these areas and the experience that we have. So we're not sort of firing blindly or just going based on charisma of pitch. We actually end up working with a lot of PhD founders, technical founders, to help them improve their pitch over time. But anyway, so that's pretty much about us, and look forward to questions, both from, I think, Randall, you have some prepared, and just from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. I think it's definitely helpful what you just mentioned for all the founders on this call anyway, especially for when they're thinking about how to approach you. So that's definitely a great thing. Yeah, so at this point, we'll allow you guys to unmute yourselves, but I'll go ahead and ask this. The first question is, what's the best way as a founder to approach an early stage investor like yourself? Is that through email, LinkedIn? How should we approach you?
Yeah, I mean, in general, and we try to actually have a process where even cold outreach can turn into something. So we have a invest@creativeventures.vc email that basically we process through and basically look at the different things that come through. In general, though, and even for us, actually, in general, it does help to basically be introduced through founders within your network or whatnot that know the VC. This does two things, one of which is obviously just in terms of reference. References are always useful in terms of it, especially standing out for someone who you're being introduced for. And that applies even outside of VC, that's just generally speaking. But also the second one is you can actually ideally talk to your reference and get a sense of if it's a good match in terms of what the VC is looking for. So for us, our area of interest is eternal, essentially. We'll tell people very, very far in advance what we're interested in, exactly what areas we invest in, and exactly what we're looking for. We tell people, for example, we're looking for concrete finishing, just in terms of robotics within construction. That level of specificity is what we get to. For other VCs, oftentimes the interest changes over time. So ideally, if you have a reference, and this is more for other VCs, but if you have a reference, that reference can also tell you something about what that VC is particularly interested in at the time. Because in some cases, if it's just something that's out of season in terms of investment interest, it'll just be much harder to get the attention of that particular VC. But again, for us, it's public, it's eternal in terms of what we invest in, what we're interested in. So you can also just look it up for us, but generally speaking, references.
Yeah, that's very good. Awesome. We have a question in the chat from Jeremy. Are you actively making new investments currently?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, very straightforward. Yeah, I guess in terms of the presentation itself, so let's say they get a meeting with you, what's going to be making the pitch deck look good, and then maybe what should be left out of that?
Oh boy. Well, for us, we actually end up looking past the pitch deck quite a bit. I would say that many of our founders are quite bad at pitching, at least to start. And look, to be fair, pitching. So a lot of folks see, okay, does the VC like resonate with my pitch or not? And am I good at pitching this as sort of a referendum on themselves or their company? The reality is pitching is actually a completely different skill. Your ability to execute, your ability to go out and get customers, and your ability to execute technically, all of these are completely separate than your ability to raise money. I mean, in reality, if you to look at late stage, there are people who are specialized, both in terms of broker dealers, whatnot, and et cetera, to raise money versus the people who actually manage and execute against the company. pitching for us, the things to get to, and the thing that I would emphasize in terms of what's most important is actually get to what you do clearly, why you're differentiated, and what specific markets you're going after. So for us, we actually do care about markets, even if you have a technology that has a lot of different application areas. In fact, most deep technologies have a lot of application areas. The trick is figuring out where you're actually going to focus in terms of entry point and how you're actually going to execute against it. Pretty much no one is able to actually take a broadly applicable technology and apply it to everything. In reality, just most of these end up specializing in terms of the area that they actually tackle. So we actually do want to know what that is in terms of, for us, in terms of pitches. But generally speaking, for broadly VC pitches, again, different skill. A lot of it is actually about trying to generate a narrative in terms of why this thing is sort of inevitable and is going to succeed. And that's a skill that we have to teach a lot of our founders separately after the round that we lead. And I think someone had asked, by the way, do we invest in healthcare medical devices? I think Abby, and yes, we do.
Very good. Yeah, awesome. And I think there was another question here about, okay, here it is, yeah. Deeptek requires a significant R&D budget. This is from Elon. What's your view regarding the ideal split between R&D and sales and marketing?
It depends entirely on the specific company and area. So I think someone else had also asked a question about like pre-revenue stuff, and that one's about ticket size, but just pre-revenue and whatnot. So it's very different if you are a robotics company tackling the logistics space versus if you are a medical device. In terms of the robotics company, you might have a pilot. It might not be a particularly representative customer pilot or anything, but you might have a pilot. You might actually have some revenue coming in. You might have some NREs or whatever, but maybe it's even a contract. Medical device, especially one that needs FDA approval, probably not, just in terms of it, especially at the stage that we'd come in. So as for an R&D budget versus sales and marketing, that depends both on what the stage you're in and what actual company you're building. So in terms of R&D, do you consider that, for example, running trials? Because in that particular case for clinical trials or pivotal trials or whatnot, healthcare and medical devices, you should probably set aside quite a bit of money for that, but it depends on what you're actually tackling. We have a company, for example, called Sealight, who one of the advisors is actually Israeli and whatnot, but one of our companies, Sealight, in terms of they do eye scan. Basically, they're able to use an ophthalmology laser to detect very small changes in terms of neurodegenerative disease. So normally gold standard is MRI. Takes actually many months to years to actually see functional changes in terms of MRI changes in terms of the brain for neurodegenerative diseases. For them, they're able to do it with a simple eye scan. They had years of studies in terms of both the relevance of the particular biomarker that they're using and their specific device before they ever jumped in to creating a company, because this was the founder's PhD thesis, or PhD dissertation and PhD work. That company can actually put less into R&D and more into some of the business development because a lot of that R&D was done ahead of time. For other companies, that's not the case. So you do have to look and tailor based on where you are and what your company is doing. One broad feedback though, and one just broad way to think about it, because I know that it depends is not a very useful answer. Think about what your next milestone is. Because in many cases, a lot of founders want to put money into everything because, like, for example, like data science work or whatever, it's going to be important in the future. I need a pipeline of other markets, other customers, other things, and I need to put money into this, invest in it early to have good long-term success. Well, the thing is, it's good to start early for some of that stuff, but if you can't make it to the next round and raise a larger round, then in that case, your company just dies at that point and you're basically not able to get to that long-term anyway. Think about what matters in terms of metrics and milestones that you can show for the next round. Because stuff that's very fluffy and squishy, like we put more data science work behind this. We built out our pipeline of other products or other indications in terms of healthcare and medical devices. But it's very hard to assess how far you actually are and how real this is. That might not be very interesting to an investor coming in at the next round. So think about concretely, I have this many sales, I have this many institutions who are signed, I have this many, whatever it is. Those are the metrics and milestones you should be spending money and going towards. And in terms of R&D, maybe that's actually, we were able to get to this scale. We went from this scale to this scale, just in terms of pilots or even just lab work or whatever. Maybe that is the milestone that the investor wants to see next. So that determines where your spending should go, not just sort of a static split.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Elon. Yeah, but we'll move to the next one. Yeah, it looks from Hanadi. It says, "Thank you for the insights. What explains your high rate of investment in women and also first-time founders? Do you invest in AI ops or observability?"
Yeah, I think for us, the main thing is we're willing to take cold outreach or sort of limited introduction outreach, because for certain folks, they don't take anything that isn't referred by a well-known founder or something, in which case, if there are disadvantaged groups traditionally that are not part of those networks, then guess what? You're actually going to have a pipeline problem. You're forever not going to actually grow it, at least not very fast. So for us, between looking very specifically at, again, these predefined features, these predefined criteria of what we actually invest in or are interested in, that means that our pipeline actually looks a lot more like, for example, not entirely, but say like the PhD populations in terms of certain of these. Do those also have diversity problems in terms of it? Yes. Are they better than general startup stats? Yes. They're also much better in terms of that. So I think that partially reflects, again, our process and how we actually approach it. Still trying to figure out better ways of improving it as well. But yeah, at this point, I guess we have industry leading stats just because of that fact. In terms of AI ops and observability, it depends, because we do look at stuff in terms of logistics, like the logistics, robotics and whatnot. That's not specifically AI ops. If you're talking about something like orchestration, a layer on top of ROS or Kubernetes or something. The thing is, a lot of those platforms, the problem is you're deploying into somewhat proprietary networks that you're looking for like system integrators or whatnot to jump into. So that's not an area that we actually have much conviction that it's easy to get traction, but it's also very hard to actually build a large concentrated, make it a large concentrated company. Again, just because of the difficulty in terms of executing, building into those system integrators or whatnot. So that becomes a pretty large challenge. As for observability, depends on for what, right? Like observability, explainability, like a lot of these different things are nice buzzwords for people, but the question is, what is it a critical thing for in terms of whatever industry? And that's sort of the challenge in terms of thinking through the importance or not of a specific technology to execute against a market.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. For the next question, it's from Flowhow, from Amit Karen. Actually, Amit, can you unmute yourself? I want to, maybe if you could explain your company just in a couple sentences or more, so that he can better answer the question.
Hi, James. Well, I wanted to ask it for the general public and not the suck up airtime. We deal on the healthcare operations side. So as you know, basically it's a broken telephone problem, different systems, different people, different data. And we're starting out by trying to help reduce denials in radiology that are about 6.5% of volume, or $10 billion a year. This is by taking data that exists, making sense out of it, and analyzing it. So sorry for the quick pitch. The context here. So one, if it's of interest, obviously happy to talk. We're on our way to our first pilot in the US now. So really exciting times. What we're trying to understand is we plan forward, is, there is a changing landscape. from friends in the Valley, I do understand that it's also reaching the early stage startups, even though Twitter says it's not. But then I prefer to believe my friends. And then the second point is it 24 or let's say 30 months, like someone like Kraft recommends, because this is where as we do our fancy pants Excels, we want this to reach the moon. So thanks. Thanks, Randall.
Of course.
So I just to clarify, the questions is around the, I think I got a little bit in terms of environment as well as like how to deal with the changing landscape. So I'm just trying to make sure I answer the question.
Yeah. So two questions. Are there any? So sorry. Apologies for not being clear enough. One. Is there any significant change in the way VCs are assessing companies now? You know, what they expect, even from specifically early stage companies like myself and quite a few others here are. I'm not talking about the valuation part. You know, is there something else we need to be further along on, research, etc.? And then two, kind of, you know, as a plug for Runway, should I be planning for 24 months or 30 months or even longer, in your opinion?
Yeah, so the second one I'll get to in a second, but just in terms of changes, I'd say, especially versus pre-pandemic, especially for healthcare companies, but also for robotics companies, and sort of AI companies and whatnot, there's more execution expected because in reality, I'm sure you've probably seen this, different healthcare entities or whatnot are more willing. There are more healthcare more healthcare entities and more like providers or whatnot willing to adopt something to try it than there used to be. Because before, you know, you had Kaiser, Cedars-Sinai, whatever. It's like they try everything. But there are now more entities that are willing to actually try something out. So it is one expectation that companies will have actually gone out there and tried more stuff out, got more LOIs, got more deployments. I think you had mentioned you had a pilot coming up. That is one thing that's expected more, just because it is easier to do. Now, commensurately, valuations have risen from that because it's de-risked somewhat. So VCs are willing to pay more. There's a question in terms of how much more and how much the valuations have squished at this point versus the sort of the height of last year. But still, valuations as a whole are still higher than they were pre-pandemic, just in terms of things. And that's probably justifiable just because of the execution and how much further the execution can be. Because in the past, it could be that for a first institutional round as a healthcare company, you had nothing. Right. But that sucks for the VC and that sucks for you because it just slows everything down. But now everything moves much faster. So that's one thing in terms of changes. As for Runway, see, the thing is that's hard, right? Because for certain companies, you can't actually create that level of runway, at least not in a smart way. Because yeah, sure, you can go into deep freeze for like 18 months or something, but that doesn't really help your that doesn't really help your company, right? So
we're not into cryogenics, so not deep freeze. Yeah,
right, exactly. So it's just in terms of it, again, think about next milestones. If you're actually able to get pretty far, even if you're trying to raise at a really bad time, say in like 8 months or something, and assuming that it's pretty bad environment at that point, if you're actually able to execute against that time and actually grow, like in terms of a huge number of pilots or whatever it is that particular VC is looking for in terms of your next milestones, yeah, you might need to price it down and not have sort of a valuation to the moon kind of thing, but you can probably still attract enough people to go for a somewhat smaller round, say like, I don't know, say like you execute and get a bunch of hospitals or whatever actually piloting it. And you're like, I'm raising 5 on 20, just in terms of 5 million on 20 million valuation. You could probably still draw people even in a pretty bad environment. It's not that much money as far as the size of the VC firms have gotten at this point. So yeah, it depends tactically a lot. I would say be careful about cutting your growth so much that you're just sort of sitting around. So I disagree a little bit in terms with YC for that, because they said if you just survive for some folks, you might win. Like, well, if you also don't go anywhere, then the new companies that are founded after this period who are coming after you might actually get further than you. So,
Super, thanks.
Perfect. I have some questions for people asking about more specifics about the areas you invest in, just because we talked about the generals, including digital mental health therapeutics and so additive manufacturing. So, can you address those two, and then any other things that interest you?
Digital therapeutics and additive manufacturing. So digital therapeutics, it depends on what it's doing. So if you're actually asking about specifics for it, lots of folks create sort of new biomarkers, or at least new synthesis of biomarkers, by basically mixing together a lot of stuff and actually trying to show that this does something. There's a few challenges for that. One of which is you actually need quite a few studies at that point to actually show that it's interesting. So one of the big challenges for trying to get hospitals or clinicians on board is like, if you have something that's an entirely new biomarker, it's like, yeah, show me, show me like 5, 6, 7, 10 years, like a decade's worth of like basic research showing me that this biomarker does something. That's a bit of a challenge. In terms of some of the other things, like, yeah, challenges for that. For digital therapeutics that was like in terms of diagnostics. For digital therapeutics itself, depends on what it is. Most things that we've seen, like we do have a company called Invaria based out of Stanford in terms of this. It's kind of in the digital therapeutic space, just in terms of as a digital biopsy or whatnot, but yeah, I mean, what counts as therapy? I guess Mobio. So we do have a company based out of Singapore. That one, perhaps you'd call more directly digital therapeutics in terms of a mental health company that works with pharmaceutical companies in terms of trying to improve mental health during certain, like for example, while taking chemo drugs or whatever. I think the challenge with a lot of these is FDA and approvers don't really know how to look at them. A lot of them start to actually blur the line between diagnostics and actually like treatment in terms of and therapeutics. They can often fall on either side of the line, which is sort of why I was sort of mixing them up before. And in terms of being able to show efficacy, it's challenging. So anyway, I don't want to sort of just rag on it. I think that there's interesting areas there. It's just there are certain things that you'll have to address just in terms of challenges for the customer base. For additive manufacturing, we've liked stuff, especially in the carbon fiber space, sort of looking at very specific materials. The overall challenge for 3D printing and additive manufacturing as a whole, though, is sort of what particular niche does it address? Because a lot of companies that are in the space sort of end at prototyping. So innovation labs, R&D shops, prototyping. For mass production, that's been a challenge actually for a long time. And I actually knew a lot of the folks in the 3D printing space from the sort of the very nascent days. And that's been a challenge, and that still is a challenge, even for the companies that have raised a lot of money tackling it. Anyway, that's probably way too much specifics in terms of both areas, but yeah, just addressing that.
I think that was good. It definitely helps some people, and other people who haven't asked questions, I'm sure, is something very similar to that. So that's awesome. Next question from Gilad Luria. Deeptek requires, obviously, it's very capital intensive. So how soon do you think revenue would be expected for those types of companies?
Again, it depends, like healthcare companies or whatever, if you need regulatory approval, your revenue might take quite a bit longer. You might not have much revenue for quite a while as well, like maybe a pilots or whatever. So we have a company called Picnic, pizza making robotics. They're going to be looking at a lot of revenue. But yeah, I mean, they've had pilot projects for a while in terms of a lot of prominent folks. It's still not much actual money coming in until once they actually deploy in terms of certain things. Suddenly, sort of overnight, you actually have a huge amount of revenue. That's actually the pattern for a lot of deep tech companies. it's not like software where you get a few customers, then a few more customers, and you create a nice viral cycle to get more and more customers in terms of steady or ideally hockey stick growth. There tends to be much more step function changes for deep tech companies where you have nothing, or very little, and then suddenly a lot. So I think for deep tech companies, it's recognizing that characteristic and knowing specifically what stage you're actually at. Also, just as a note for time to mature and money to mature, one assertion that we always have is actually deep tech companies take less capital to get to scale than software companies. And we're always kind of surprised by it, but now BCG, Hello Tomorrow, whatever, have their fancy report that says the same thing. And the intuition is this: look, in terms of software companies, you can basically pour infinite amounts of money into growth. So if you think about in Salesforce before, Uber, et cetera, even in terms of the later stage one, like Uber, et cetera, for customer acquisition, you pretty much have no end for putting in money to keep doing marketing campaigns, keep trying to grow the company, keep trying to get to as close as you can to the total absolute population in terms of users of your product. For deep tech companies, that just doesn't tend to be the case. Once you get to a certain stage, it's probably advantageous at that point to exit in terms of an acquisition, or sure, maybe an IPO, but usually an acquisition. So medical device company, you might want to sell to Medtronics with Stryker, blah, blah, blah. Sort of the list of folks who actually have larger sales forces who can put the money into expanding your product to other indications to be able to take it to scale. For robotics companies, maybe at that point, it makes sense to sell to one of your large customers, if you're a logistics company or whatnot, or even in terms of food services, either one of the staffing companies, et cetera, something for that. For ag robotics, for example, maybe you're selling at that point to John Deere, Caterpillar, et cetera. There tends to be a finite endpoint, which means the total amount of capital to scale is actually more fixed and constrained, and it actually tends to be less to get to a successful outcome than for a comparable software company.
Very well said. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, I guess an important one also here, since we have most people still on the call, what's the best way to get in contact with you to send all these startups send their information to you? So what's a good email, or what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way is probably we have an invest@creativeventures.vc email. If you send it to me directly, it might just get lost in my sea of email. I think at peak, I've had 6,000 emails a day. So if you send it to me, don't be surprised if you don't end up getting a response for a while. So it's probably easiest to sort of go through our funnel that way.
Awesome. We just got a question from Jeremy. How do you define a successful outcome on an investment? I guess to follow on to this, is it reaching milestones? Is it greater than larger revenues? What would be the successful outcomes?
Well, so internally, we see it. So we don't have ownership targets. We don't have a lot of these other things. The specific thing that we want to see is basically this particular company contributes towards our internal 3 to 5x. So of the fund as a whole. So most funds don't actually like to say what they're targeting, leaves it nice and open in terms of if you don't have any concrete metrics that you're shooting towards. But for top quartile VC funds, typically speaking, you actually get returns of 3 to 5x. And again, that's top quartile. That tends to actually be the very tippy top. We target towards that, and that's sort of our area that we try to get towards, which means if you think about it, if you have survival rates or whatnot in terms of certain startups, get 1 to 3x, certain startups fail or whatever, we have a model where we have a higher survival rate. So we're actually okay with in a blended investment as a whole, looking something like a 10 to 15x. So total, just in terms of value increase. If you think about that, you do have to do a little bit of mental math for, well, in terms of my initial round, right? The VC put in this money, but then there's going to be dilution for the next rounds. And it actually matters how many rounds of dilution I have, because that's sort of, you multiply by, say, 20% dilution each round. So you're selling 20% of the company. You basically multiply the ownership that the VC has if they don't put in more by 0.8 each time you do another round or whatever. So by the end of that, and based on whatever exit valuation you have, does that chunk equal something in terms of whatever end valuation that you have, something that comes out to 10 to 15x, at least for us. But a lot of VCs have similar sort of criteria. In some cases, they have much higher multiple requirements because they have a much larger death rate in terms of companies. So, classically, Andreessen is not just 10x, it's 100 or 1,000 or whatnot x in order to actually make a company ultimately worthwhile. But for us, that is our metric, and being able to look at a company and see that sort of outcome, especially as you blend in more investment over time as well.
Yeah, the numbers on that definitely make sense. I guess to follow on this question, a question of mine, and I think there was a question actually in the chat. So do you make follow-on investments because you're a seed stage investor? And do you make those larger? You said your check size already, but would you make the follow-on investments for companies you've already invested in at the seed stage?
We do. Yeah, and we try to. So our reserve is basically to try to be able to double or triple our investment in terms of the company over time. But our particular strategy is we try to deploy that early. So if things are going well, ideally, we do not stick with you in terms of continuing to, at least from our own fund, continue to put more and more money into your like B or C or D or whatever it is. We still end up being actually quite active through the entire life cycle and much more active than most VCs, but we try to deploy it early. One, we think we have more advantage versus other VCs in terms of that, but also two, it tends to actually be the more valuable time to deploy it for a company. Look, as a deep tech company or as a company that's harder to understand, it is easy to raise money once your financials tell the story. So say like B or C round or whatever, any idiot can come in, look at your financials, go, oh, a lot of money, good margins. I have no idea what this thing does. I don't care. I'm putting money into it, right? Like at that stage, it doesn't matter. Like VCs can jump, like whoever can jump into it. This is why VCs are having a big problem versus Tiger and some other folks. Well, until Tiger like runs out of money because their hedge fund loses all their money. But while Tiger and whatnot exists and these other folks are there, this is why a lot of these traditional financial players can jump in and take those excess rounds there. In terms of the early rounds, we like to deploy because we actually tend to be the ones who understand it, and you need more of that money to just sort of get the initial boost to get to that stage where it becomes more obvious for all the other investors. Because at that point, our money's not that important, at least not to you, just because you have plenty of it to choose from if you have a strong looking business.
Mm-hmm. Is there a valuation that's too high of a number? Just not including, I guess, just for anything that you would invest in. Is there something that would be too high?
So given the fact that you can play around with this on a spreadsheet as well, but for us, because we expect that stuff probably is capped around 1 to 5 billion in terms of exit valuation, something starting to get past, say, like 25 or 30 for initial round is actually it gets very, very difficult, right? You actually are starting to look at economics because again, you have to play around with it. Like, okay, we have this, then put in more money and sort of blend it out. And does it actually come out to something like 10 to 15? It actually becomes very hard to do that as you get very, very high in terms of that scale. The lower in terms of it, the more room you have to work with as well, which is actually, by the way, another thing to mention in terms of valuations. It's not always advantageous to shoot for the moon. I know it's nice to look at it and go, oh, I gave away less ownership in terms of this. I was able to get more money. That all works until you run into a ditch in terms of the next round if you overraised and are not able to actually accomplish milestones that justify your next round of investors. Think of it sort of as a ladder. It's very nice and all if you're able to reach somewhat higher on the ladder and pull yourself up. It's not so nice if it just turns out that doing that, you end up missing another rung above you. So yeah, you have to think about the trade-offs for that. Anyway, sort of a tangent in terms of that. I think someone's asking now valuation or safe as well. Sorry, I'm just sort of tiny chat thing. Valuation. Safes have challenges. people are lazy. That's why they like safe. And not just the founders, by the way, the VCs also, or the investors are sometimes lazy in terms of, that's why safes are nice. It's like, no worries, no whatever it is, it seems nice. But in terms of safes, one is they're legally weird. Most investors who are credible shouldn't love them too much just because of that legal and tax and whatnot weirdness. But even putting that aside, because you don't really care as a founder. So yeah, putting that aside, safes create an interesting dynamic where if your cap is too low, well, so if your cap is too low, if your cap is too high, it creates different dynamics. But the bigger dynamic that I more wanted to get to is safes have a tendency to create more safes because say you raised a safe round. Oops, I don't quite have the milestones to not make these safes convert at a ridiculous level or at a ridiculous amount that takes too much ownership away. I got to get further. In order to make my valuation high enough or whatever, so that the new investors coming in and the safes converting don't like demolish my cap table. So I just need to raise that little bit more in terms of safes to put that up in order to get there. So you tend to actually have this spiral where you have a giant overhang of safes that encourage raising more safes in order to not convert and to sort of keep going on. So it's better for everyone's incentives, and it tends to be less weird in terms of dynamics as you go on if you do priced rounds. The downside of priced rounds is you actually need to know something about the price, which at least for us, it's like, okay, the entire discipline thing goes into that. We should be able to put a price on this and know what your next round looks like. And ideally you do too. Again, this entire spiral safe thing happens because you don't know what milestones you're trying to get to, and you're just sort of kicking that can down the road. It's kind of important to know what milestones are next and what valuation that can actually be priced at in order to plan correctly. Because again, remember, where do you put your money? In whatever gets you to those next milestones that give you the highest price and get you the furthest in terms of being able to get to that next round. If you don't know what that is, you're just sort of firing blindly, right? Including with where you're spending money.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I'll just have a couple last questions here, and then of course anyone can chime in at any moment. But I guess going back to just the meeting itself and how long it takes from start to finish. How long is that diligence, especially post meeting? It sounds like it went well. How long would that diligence process be?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like I've sort of joked that the fastest that we've had is like 30 minutes, but that's not realistic just because we knew about the company for a while. We have a ton of research already pre-done, et cetera. So in general, we don't invest in anything that we haven't already done a ton of research in, just in terms of area. So even before we take meetings, we actually do a ton of research, have a really good understanding, or try to anyway, of the specific market and what we're looking at. Even so, it does actually still take like, say, 4 to 6 weeks, just in terms of going through the process. So our process, if you're curious, it's not very transferable or useful for other VCs, but if you're curious, we have a go, no go stage just in terms of rough market size and rough thesis fit. Does this fit? So just to give you a very quick answer, because if it's just sort of out of bounds entirely, we're not going to waste your time or our time or whatever, just in terms of spinning in circles. So we'll give you a very quick answer in terms of that. If that goes through, then the sort of indeterminate longer stage is the researching phase in terms of we have more detailed questions, because again, we're more active. We tend to be more like involved in terms of stuff. So you also don't want us to come in and be stupid and not understand the specific things or have the details or understanding. So that researching phase usually is the thing that takes the bulk of the time, just in terms of those weeks. And then finally for us, partner meeting, just in terms of final pitch call with the entire investment team on our side. From that, we basically make a decision. Though if you actually get to this funnel stage here, you have a pretty good probability. It's something like 75 to 80% in terms of investment. So sort of high filter rate is at go, no go. Then there's a moderate filter rate at researching, and then there's like pretty high probability at the end. Again, we track a lot of stuff, so we can actually give you some probability estimates as you go along. But yeah, that's our process. That's not very transferable to other folks, but if you're curious.
I think that's extremely helpful for everyone here. Yeah, then just the last question: do you have any personal pet peeves for if you're on a call with a founder, or just something? I know all of them are quirky in their own way, but something that you're looking for in the presentation, maybe something they should leave out, any of the above.
Yeah, and to plug, not that that's actually important to plug in, but yeah, I wrote an article in terms of this. But if you have so many things that you cannot tell anyone, like if I tell someone's going to steal this idea or whatever, you do not have a good business. By the time, if you're launching, you have by definition told everyone what you're doing. If you lose your advantage the moment someone hears what you're doing, it is not a good business. Don't do it. Don't waste your time in terms of it. Yeah, if the mere act of like speaking about it, like basically destroys your market, and like you have competitors popping up left and right, it's not a good business. So for folks who are very, so look, for certain things like, okay, I gotta finish patents in terms of this, and there's certain things I can disclose, not disclose. Yeah, that makes sense. But in terms of having experience also dealing with patents or whatnot, you can talk about quite a bit and not like breach the line into stuff where you're actually like stepping on your claims or whatnot at patents in terms of what's disclosed or whatever. Plus, file a prelim patent, like just get that out there and get it done so that you have a filing date in terms of that. So people who are very, very cagey about everything just in terms of their business, like their technology, whatever it is, it's generally a pretty bad sign. And I say this because I know for some folks, they just get advice to do that. Just because, you got to worry about patents, you got to worry about competition, whatever. Actually think hard about it. Like, is it actually going to destroy your business to tell someone about it? Because again, if it is, you have no defensibility, no barrier to entry, and no reason why you should actually spend years of your life trying to build this.
Yeah, that's very, very useful. And I'll get that link from you later, and I'll share it with everyone here afterwards, as well as the email. Sure. And then, of course, in the follow-up email, I'll also include this video. So in case you missed something, joined late, dropped out, or anything like that, you can absolutely have a recap of everything we talked about, because I know there's a lot of useful tidbits in here. But that's all the questions for me. I'm going to open it up to the floor for anyone else who has other questions here.
Nice. I've got a quick one back on the therapeutics area.
Sure.
It's taking a look at Mobio, super interesting with the kind of remote PPG on the face, and working with a company on the kind of similar area, looking at heart rate and HRV. Do you know if Mobio is using anything with music in terms of a therapeutic, or if they've looked at that? We're mapping essentially different types of music to people's HRV, seeing exactly what works for them in their mental health. Curious if you've seen Mobio do anything in that region, or if you all have checked out any solutions in that area.
Yeah, Mobio specifically, though, I haven't had the latest updates. Someone else on our team covers that particular company in terms of board or whatever, but I don't think they have. I know they've looked at some stuff in terms of integrating other sensors, and if heart rate, then yeah, HRV makes sense in terms of that. But yeah, I don't think directly, and not specifically with music. It does sound like you're tackling a very different area than they are.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. They're getting that just from the face. They get your HRV. It seems like non-contact. So we're currently using wearables, and it seems like they're also pitching that non-wearable way to get HRV. So it might be a useful. Yeah, I'd be curious to see. Maybe I'll send Randall or you a note on it and see if we can connect with them around that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening within the remote. Well, I mean, it's not. So again, like these definitions, like, is that remote monitoring? Is it like the fact that you have a thing like vitals? Is that remote? Anyway, whatever. Yeah. Putting aside whatever the labels are, in terms of like taking vitals in a non-hospital setting, let's define it that way. Yeah, that's an interesting area. There's a lot of developments in terms of that, and yeah, hospitals and providers are getting a lot more open to that. Billing still sucks. That's something to think about if you're doing a company in the space, that billing really sucks. And if you're planning on using that remote patient monitoring code, I'd suggest finding a different way, just from experience, in terms of that being usually a bad idea. But, sorry, tangent as well, but in case that's useful. All right. And also iPulse, I think, is asking, I'm sorry if I missed anything in chat. I have it set as a very small window, so I can only see the last one. What is, if we put all the information, I assume this is on the website, if you put all the information there. Yeah, I mean, folks will basically go through it and take a look, and we'll let you know in terms of sort of go, no go stage. Our automation is currently broken, but normally that feeds directly into our like little CRM system where we go through it and whatnot, but we'll get that fixed. But anyway, we'll go through it manually.
Any other questions here by anybody? Okay, well, if you do, happy to, share those with James and the team. And of course, James, thank you for, giving us an hour of your time. Really appreciate it. We know you could be spending this, looking up companies, doing some research, or, a myriad of other things. So, thank you very much for answering our questions and, just explaining about your fund, how to approach an investor and everything related to that. That's just a really good use of the time here. I know I speak for everyone here when we say thank you very much for that.
Yeah, always happy to share. Always happy to be transparent in terms of this. Definitely should not be a dark art or something in terms of approaching investors or whatever, or ideally it shouldn't be. So yeah, happy to be able to share in terms of these, happy to be transparent, and yeah, look forward to hearing from a lot of different folks and sort of seeing everything grow and continue to develop in this ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to everyone here on the call, thanks for joining as well. I know it's late in Israel, so thanks for giving the time here or wherever you're located. Thank you for spending an hour with us here on the call. I'll make sure to follow up with an email. Most likely that'll be tomorrow or the next day, with everything related to what we did on the session. Yeah, but again, thanks to James, thanks to Creative Partners, and yeah, thank you for coming on.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.
So set it up. Take care, y'all.